Greetings, everybody. We are super excited and elated to have with us Professor Madhavi Menon for this installment of the Probe Dialogue. Professor Menon needs no introduction. She is a professor of English at at Ashoka University, where she also serves as the director of the Center for Studies in Gender and Sexuality. Professor Menon has written extensively about queerness, Shakespeare, sexuality, and dealt with questions of identity, politics, and queerness. On behalf of the Probe and the caucus, we are extremely grateful to you for taking time out of your schedule and agreeing to do this. Just for a brief introduction of what the Probe and the caucus does, would pass forward now to Gauri. Thank you, Gauri.
Hello, ma'am. So, Caucus is the discussion forum of Hindu College, a premier institute of India. We're a 16-year-old student-led and non-partisan think tank that opines on a plethora of issues in politics, economy, international relations, and beyond. The Probe is a student-run monthly magazine, which was started in December 2020 by the students of Caucus. It was aimed to cultivate a reading and writing culture within the student community. It has generated substantial readership in the student community, with students across India and even the world writing for us. It is with this aim that we have envisioned engaging with experts like you, and we're really delighted to have you here. So over to Pratham to start the interview.
Yeah, so the first question. I really loved your book, Infinite Variety, A History of Desire. And in that book, you have reflected intensely upon desire, its messiness, its ambiguity, and its complexity, and how it is in its very erratic nature that its power to complicate and sort of subvert lives. Keeping all this in mind, where do we place or position desire in a project of queerness in terms of what are the roles that desire can play in sort of queer politics / liberation?
What was your last word again? Instead of queer politics /
liberation, queer politics / liberation.
Right. Okay. Thank you. Thanks, Pratham. Thanks, Gauri. Thank you to the Probe and to the caucus. Thank you for your very kind introduction. I have some things to say about that as well, but we can come to that later maybe. I'll just sort of begin by addressing your question, and it's very nice to be here. As you have just pointed out, Pratham, the word I tend to use in my writings, rather than identity or rather than even representation, is the word desire and sexuality. I rarely use even gender. As the tongue twister of the title of my center, which gave you pause as well, suggests, it studies in gender and sexuality. Many people tend to think of gender and sexuality as the same thing, or desire and identity as the same thing, or sexuality and identity as the same thing. And one of my impetuses for writing and thinking the way I do is to drive a bit of a wedge or create a bit of space and oxygen and room between what we think of as desire and what we think of as identity. Because we're very quick, aren't we, these days, to say, oh, this is the object of my desire, therefore I must be. If I'm a woman desiring a woman, I must be a lesbian. If I'm a woman desiring a man, I must be heterosexual. And it's almost like a key, or what we in Delhi University used to call a kunji, that there's always an answer to a particular kind of problem. And my investment is in staying with the problem rather than finding an answer. Because for me, answers are much more unsatisfactory, because it puts an end to the question. It sort of says, here is the problem that's been unraveled, and therefore you don't need to think about this anymore. And given the importance that desire plays in our lives, given how crucial it is, not just to making us who we are, but to unmaking who we might want to be, I think this is something we need to keep thinking about rather than presuming that we have an answer to it. So if we want to keep thinking about it, if we want to really respect the wrecking ball that desire can be in our lives, we need to stop sort of giving it an identity. Now, I completely understand that identities can be and are extremely crucial to assert and inhabit in certain moments of life and at certain sort of points in our lives, and we can talk about that later on as well. But I think the immediate rush to provide an answer without actually staying with the question is something that I think of as problematic. which is why my use of desire rather than liberation or rather than identity, because I don't think desire is necessarily always good. It doesn't always free us. It often binds us and shackles us. It's often something we have to fight against. We often don't like our desires, but that doesn't mean that we don't actually grapple with them, that we're not humbled by them. And I think we need to sort of finding an identity is a sort of more hubristic and arrogant move, as far as I can see, rather than something that allows you to be in the grip of a desire that one can't completely control.
Yeah, makes sense. Very interesting, and that reminds me of your work in Difference to Difference, where you also talk about the sort of pitfalls of uh, to limiting queerness to sort of this identitarian specificity. We will definitely take this up later. Yeah, Gauri, for next question.
Ma'am, in your work, you've extensively spoken about how there exists a sea of difference in the way desire is thought about and experienced in the Indian subcontinent as opposed to the West, where modernity's obsession with codification and categorization significantly limited avenues of desires flexibility. How has this impacted the way expressions in manifestations of desire have two different contexts?
Gauri, I think you froze in the middle or something cut out. I lost you at how has this impacted what?
Am I audible?
You cut out in the middle.
Just a second. Is my voice clear now?
Yeah,
Okay, so I'll repeat the entire question.
thank
So
you.
basically, what I want to know that in your work you've spoken extensively about how there exists a difference in the way desire is thought about and experienced in the Indian subcontinent as opposed to the West, where there's this obsession with codification and categorization, which limits desires flexibility. So, how has this impacted the way expressions and manifestations of desire have evolved in the two contexts?
Right. Thank you, Gauri, and thanks for repeating the question as well. I want to begin by saying that I am actually a little wary of using the phrase the West or the East as though they're two completely different things that are divorced from each other. As we know, and long before we've been living in a so-called globalized world, as we well know, there has always been traffic and commerce between different parts of the world. That there have always been interactions, even if you think of it as on a literary level, you can see the way in which stories have traced their roots across different parts of the world. And so you can't really say this is a Western tale or this is an Eastern tale. The Arabian Nights is actually a classic example of something that has traversed both East and West. So I want to caution us against using either the East or the West in a monolithical sense. Certainly, I understand as a shortcut or as a shorthand, it's very useful for us to use it at times, but we need to be wary rather than saying this is, us and that is them. We have just seen an amazing, amazing, amazing election result in India, which has rejected a certain kind of parochialism. So I want to guard against that. I don't want to sort of say, we are better than they or than them. So having said that, I do want to emphasize, though, I think what you were referring to, Gauri, in my work, I do want to emphasize that there have been parts of the world, several parts of the world, the Indic subcontinent is just one example, at different points in time, that have provided far more options than we currently think are available to us. And when I say we, I mean people in the Indic subcontinent as well, right? Now, everyone seems to speak a language of identity around the world. Everyone seems to want to speak a language of this is who I am or this is who you are. And I want to think about alternatives. I want to think about options. I want to think about plurality rather than singularity. To go back to Pratham's earlier question, the minute we come up with an identity, we're coming up with a sense of singularity. I don't believe any one of us is ever singular. I believe, as Walt Whitman says, that we contain multitudes, right? That every one of us is far more complex than we would like to pretend that we are. And so I'm interested in alternatives. So, for instance, and this is what I meant when I said I'd like to go back to what you both were saying in the beginning. When Pratham was introducing himself, he sort of also told us what his pronouns were and asked you what yours were. Luckily, neither of you asked me because I would have said, nothing, you can do what you want. But one of my real interests in this question about pronouns is that it is an extremely Anglocentric question, by which I mean English actually is an ungendered language except for pronouns. There are lots of European languages that are completely drenched in gender. So, French, Italian, everything is gendered, right? A table is gendered, a chair is gendered. What's interesting for us in the Indic subcontinent, and I don't mean that everyone speaks the same language or anything of the kind, but whatever language we speak, whether it's gendered or non-gendered, we tend not to have gendered pronouns. And this is very important for us to keep in mind, right? So whether we speak Urdu, Hindi, Punjabi, Malayalam, Tamil, whatever it is, and some of these languages are more gendered than others. For instance, Hindi and Urdu are far more gendered than, let's say, Tamil and Malayalam are. But whatever language we speak, there is no equivalent of he, she. So even if you say, even if you take a language like Punjabi, which is also very gendered, there's no he or she, there's, asi or tusi, there's me and you. Those are the pronouns. So so this is one concrete example, a concrete way in which I think we have the ability, the linguistic and conceptual ability to occupy a register that is not singularly Anglophone. Now, I'm not saying that, we should shun English, not at all. I would be out of a job. And I love English. It's my primary language. All I'm saying is that before we translate linguistic singularity onto conceptual singularity, we need to pause and think. And there are some of us in some parts of the world who are better equipped to perform that act of thinking than, let's say, monolingual people might be. If our only language were English, we would not be able to submit to critical scrutiny this demand for pronouns. But because none of us on the Indian subcontinent has only one language, everyone has at least two, some of us have three or four. We are in a space, we are in a position to actually think critically and theoretically about what the demand is that's being made on us. Now, let's pause to think about this some more. If the demand is, let us not take anyone for granted. Let us give people the freedom to tell us what they would like us to see them as. I'm completely in support of that. But if the demand is, everyone needs to speak the same language of identity, then that fills me with a bit of trepidation. So then our question becomes, how do we respect the former principle, which is to allow people freedom and respect them without necessarily giving in to the second demand of uniformity or making people sound the same. And so that is the space that I think our work needs to open up. That is the politics that we need to inhabit. And it comes actually so easily to us, and we have been encouraged perhaps to forget that ease and to speak in tongues that don't necessarily sit comfortably with us.
Brilliantly put, ma'am. I completely agree with the fact that even though we have this need to have this certain individuality, but we still exist in multitudes, and I completely agree with that. Now, over to Pratham.
Also, so sorry for not asking your pronouns. I am, that was, no, yeah, but I get your idea. That's an interesting thing to think about. And definitely, how, so for instance, a lot of our queer terminologies would not exist in Indian languages. So a lot of Indian languages do not have those terminologies. So interesting. And I would now want us to go back to your first answer, where you sort of tried to link desire and sexuality. And I think this you also mentioned in your work, how, insofar as we think of sexuality as a system that sort of, demarcates our fantasies and acts of intimacy into watertight categories, don't you think sexuality then becomes sort of an inaccurate lens to approach desire, in the sense that it will always fail to capture, which is perhaps a wrong word when we talk about desire, to sort of articulate desire in all its entirety and in its nuances. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Pratham. Please realize that I wasn't faulting you for not asking me my pronouns because, as I said, I never answer that question. In fact, I don't think it's a question that I particularly think should be uniformly asked. So please, there's no need to apologize for that. You see, the tricky part of using terms like desire and or sexuality is that these are very slippery terms. So, depending on what perspective you're coming from, these terms can even be interchangeable. So, yes, as you said rightly, in my book, I think about sexuality as, as someone like even Freud thought about it as a sort of settled system that one can examine as a system. And as opposed to that, I posit desire, which is not settled and which is not systematic and therefore sort of escapes this lens of systematicity in our lives. But then if you're coming at it, say, from the perspective of Lacanian psychoanalysis, for Lacan, desire is the thing that actually is systematic, that names the unconscious, and the unconscious is the site of a sexuality that can never actually be owned or can never be known. So terminologically, these terms are very slippery. And so the way in which I use them may not at all be the way in which another queer theorist might use them. And that's part of what keeps the field rigorous, right? That's part of what keeps us on our toes, is that we have to keep grappling with how we use certain terms. Now, for me and for my use, even though I'm extremely indebted to both Lacanian and Freudian psychoanalysis, I'm using desire not as that which makes us legible, not as that which allows us to live in the world, but as that which potentially threatens our being in the world. So you see, this is the whole. Even if we take the language of, let's say, sexual liberation, again, to go back to your first question, Pratham, and again, one of the metaphors that we have imported wholesale into other parts of the world is this idea of the closet, which again, I don't think is the most appropriate metaphor, but if we just sort of stick with that for a moment, the very idea of saying we've come out of the closet is an indicator of liberation, right? That we are now finally free to speak our truth. Thinking about that metaphor or thinking about that utterance from the vantage point of desire actually complicates it, because there is no one truth about ourselves. And this is to go back, Gauri, to what we were talking about, multitudes, right? There is no one truth about ourselves. So, and this is someone like Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick has made an excellent point of this. And she says, of the many, many, many attributes that go into making up ourselves, why do we fixate on a single one, which is object choice, as designating the truth about ourselves, right? What is there about this one thing, as opposed to fantasies, as opposed to politics, as opposed to multitudinous desires, as opposed to shame, as opposed to pride, all these things? Why do we pick just the one, which is object choice? So in other words, the metaphor of freedom or of liberation is itself an extremely constrained one. And so if you feel that you are being true to yourself, then this is the language you have to speak. So again, going back to that idea of the kunji, right? The key that unlocks yourself. And now what would be the consequence if we were to stick with the lock? Not in the sense of saying we are blocked or our desires are blocked, but that what I say to you today about myself could well be untrue tomorrow for myself. And can I give myself the freedom to inhabit that contradiction, that plurality, that distinction? And I think that's where the question of respect actually comes from. Not saying, tell me who you are. That demand is not a respectful demand. But to say who you are might change from moment to moment, who I am might change from moment to moment, is for me a far more, not just respectful, but a far more accurate approach to our lives and our desires in life.
Yeah, makes sense. Very interesting. You pointed out this contradiction one you also mentioned in your book, and how we also, I will now like to go back to your argument about how, so one of the arguments you put forth in your book is about how the conceptualization of desire in this part of the world was far more flexible, so as to say. So we had multiple options. Now, one problem that I had with that was, it's very easy to be co-opted by the right wing, who would then come ahead and say, ki, oh, see, we were always progressive, and then the entire idiom of the invaders came, of quote unquote invaders came, and that sort of cultural deterioration. So, how do we sort of guard against that slippery slope? Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's a very, very good question. And frankly, if you'd asked me that before Tuesday, I would have been filled with much more angst. I'm feeling much lighter after Tuesday, so I'm feeling less angst-ridden now. It's a very good question. It's a very pertinent question. We have seen versions of this playing out in India over the last 10 years. And it's a version that I certainly had to grapple with when I was writing Infinite Variety, which is that how is my project different from a right-wing project that harks back to a certain quote-unquote Hindu glorious past, which was destroyed allegedly by Muslims coming in and then later by the British coming in. I sort of agree with a critical view of the British, but not about the Muslims, and I will talk about both. For me, there was a very, very simple rule of thumb, which I still abide by, which is if you are looking to the past in order to uncover a singular narrative of glory accruing to one single set of people, then your project is a right-wing project. If you are looking to the past to uncover impurity rather than purity, to uncover plurality rather than singularity, to uncover messiness rather than straightness, then your project can certainly still be co-opted by the right, but it is not in and of itself a right-wing project. So I like to think of my work as belonging to that latter category, which is I don't care about purity. I'm not invested in who got where first. And this goes back to what I was saying about how the East and the West have always been in conversation with one another. I'm invested in what we are speaking now, in the language that we are speaking now, and how that might actually be a far more denuded and watered down version from the languages we might have spoken in the past. The trouble with the right wing in India always has been that the language they're speaking now is the language they have wanted to find in the past, which is we are singular now and pure now, and we were singular and pure in the past. My problem always has been we pretend to be singular and pure now, but we were multiple and messy, which is to say we were different. And so what might that difference teach us rather than singularity or sameness? What a lot of phobic Hindutva forget. I actually forget is the wrong word to use because they never knew it in the first place. What a lot of them choose never to know is that as a religion, and you can look this up anywhere you want, as a religion, and believe me, I am not in favor of any religiosity whatsoever. I don't like any kind of religion at all. But the religion that has been most sex affirmative in the history of the world is Islam. It is the only religion that looks down upon asceticism, that frowns upon celibacy. And whatever we might think of that is the truth of the matter. So to say suddenly, Muslims came into the country in the 9th century, 8th century, and suddenly this grand Hindu openness suddenly got straightened is simply and factually incorrect and inaccurate. And I would strongly recommend to anyone who wants to make such a statement just to spend half an hour of their lives reading up things, even just on Google if they don't want to actually pick up a book and read it. Yeah. So having said that, I want to emphasize two things. One is that the largest corpus of male homoerotic poetry in the world is Farsi and Urdu and Hindustani poetry written primarily in Persia and the Indian subcontinent, in the world. So when Anglophone speakers and writers currently say, we are so liberated, we're writing all this queer poetry, they simply do not know any better. So when I said that the Hindutva bigots are ignorant, I will equally say that about a certain kind of liberationist politic spouting person who is equally ignorant of what happens in the rest of the world, right? If we are to believe the Anglophone sort of publicity about themselves, right? Like if we just take the US, for example, the US is so pleased with itself at most times. One would think that before the sort of trans movement in the US, that there were no trans people anywhere else in the world. So there's ignorance on so many fronts among so many people. And really the best thing we can do is at least to educate ourselves and to go back to something I said earlier, a little more humble in the face of the multiplicity and plurality that exists in the world, right? So we have then, and this is what makes the Indic subcontinent such an amazing space for exploration about desire, is that you have this the amazing corpus, philosophically, historically, literarily, in terms of religious traditions. You have this extraordinary corpus of multiple non-normative desires at our fingertips. What happens when the British come in, and it's not always clear that this is who the Hindutva bigots mean when they mean invaders, but and I'm not talking about them as invaders either. I'm talking about them using the technical term, which is colonizers, right? When the British colonizers came into the Indian subcontinent, there is no doubt that they brought with them a cultural arsenal in addition to a military one, right? If it was just a military arsenal, the British could never have conquered the world. What they brought with them was a cultural arsenal, a religious arsenal, and a political arsenal. The cultural arsenal, and someone like me, I think, is particularly well placed to recognize the irony of this, included being the first country in the world to actually teach Shakespeare in the classroom. So Presidency College in Calcutta is the first college in the world to actually teach Shakespeare. And of course, not teach Shakespeare properly, because if anyone studied Shakespeare, they would see that they're not in the presence of normative sexuality. But the cultural baggage that the British brought was a baggage of normativity. And everything was shoehorned to fit that bag. Everything was stuffed into it. And so the idea of a norm, the idea of a sexual norm that quickly coalesced around the nub of reproductive heterosexuality was a British invention, was, one might say, the British invention that allowed them to conquer the world and set up the empire. And so the language we are speaking today, and you just have to look at the many matrimonial sites in India today, that language is the language of the British. It is not the language even of the Vedic cultures that flourished in India. It is certainly not the language of the Islamic cultures that came into India. It is the language of the British. That is the language that we're speaking now. And if we are to say, or those who say that this is the language that Hindus have spoken for centuries, the only word I can say to that comment is that it is quite simply wrong.
Yeah, interesting. And your point about Islam takes you back towards this beat who talks about where we're increasingly seeing Islam as being anti-queer, and that sort of justify the war on terror and the entire U.S. military project, how it panned out. Yeah, Gauri, you can go ahead.
Yes, ma'am. So you spoke about how essentially the British used cultural arsenal in a way to influence the subcontinent, and you've spoken about it in your book, The Law of Desire, as well. So, like you pointed out how modern Hindu nationalism essentially speaks the colonial language of desire and morality. So, would you say that in a post-colonial India, this co-option has somewhat manifested in the dominant ways we as common people even think about desire, like how culturally entrenched it has become? And would you think that caste, class, and religion have any form of bearing on this, have any form of bearing on how we as common people in our daily lives think about desire?
Yeah. I think there is, again, to go back to the question of language. And, I'm a professor of English literature, so it makes sense for me to be interested in language, but I think it should be a more widespread concern, right? And to go back to something that Pratham said earlier, where he said that there are many languages in India that don't have the kind of equivalent terms for what we might use in English for sexuality, even the word sexuality. And so, what difference might that make? And for me, what's interesting is not necessarily the literal word, the absence or presence of the literal word, but the absence or presence of the conceptual word as well, right? So, and for me, Indian languages certainly have alternative theoretical modes of thinking about desire and sexuality, right? So, yes, certainly one of the oldest, most phobic books that the subcontinent produced. No surprise, the book that the British seized upon with glee because it was sounded more British than the British is the Manusmriti, where Manu cannot think about desire outside caste, right? So everything, all his pronouncements on desire are rooted through caste. What's interesting there, and this is where it's so important for us to remember that sexuality and desire are never only one thing, that there are always multiple things, right? What's interesting to think about in the Manusmriti is that actually it is quite, to use the way we use the word today, it is quite a queer-friendly book because it recognizes men having sex with men. It recognizes women having sex with women all these thousands of years ago. The thing is, it punishes them, but it punishes them fairly lightly, right? So, for instance, an upper caste man having sex with a lower caste man, if he has a bath while fully clothed, that sin is washed away from him. An upper caste woman having sex with a low caste woman, depends on whether the low caste woman is a virgin or not. And if she's a virgin, then the finger of the middle of the older woman has to be cut off, her head has to be shaved. These are fairly mild punishments compared to what the British brought in. However, they are absolutely phobic in relation to caste. So the sinfulness is not a man having sex with another man. The sinfulness is an upper caste man having sex with a lower caste man, right? So you see how desire cuts in different ways. But what's interesting is that desire always, and this is a rhetoric that unfortunately spans history, chronology, culture, politics, and this is why the British were able to get into India the way in which they did, is that this rhetoric always falls on the side of dirt versus purity, or clean versus unclean. And there are different versions of this, right? So, and right and wrong are versions of clean and unclean. And so the minute you have caste, and this is something that the subcontinent has to hang its head in shame for. The minute you have caste, you have introduced the primary division along which sexuality currently gets understood, which is that which is good, fruitful, productive on the one hand, and that which is debased, fallen, unclean on the other. As I said, there are different ways and different terms along which we can make the separation, but the fundamental basis of that separation is always the same. It's the separation on which caste is built. It's the separation that the British exploited absolutely to their credit when they came into the country and saw that they actually had a ready-made population that was so eager to believe in this idea of pollution, in this idea of something being pure and something being polluted. So this is what I call a theoretical language. So whether or not we have the actual term in terms of a literal language, we have a landscape that is populated by a theoretical language of purity versus pollution. And so it's very easy to pluck that language and make it do what one will. In many ways, what's amazing about the Indic subcontinent is that we went so many thousands of years with different forms of pollution, different forms of purity, different forms of impurity, mingling with each other in a way that did not create the kind of levels of phobia and hatred that we have seen in the last 10 years.
Very interesting how you point out that in a certain way, the Indian population was very keen on this idea of pollution, because a lot of times we see, on all spectrum, on all spheres of the political spectrum, people pointing out that the British essentially polluted these ideas of morality onto us. But our population already had a certain idea of purity within themselves when it came to
Definitely.
caste and even religion. So yeah, over to Pratham.
Yeah, so now I would like to talk about something more contemporary. So, there is obviously a lot of substance to the claim that there is no such thing as ethical consumption under capitalism or neoliberalism that we currently inhabit. What do you think is particularly bad with the phenomenon of rainbow capitalism? In the sense that, we have now seen a complete appropriation of queerness by neoliberal modes of governmentalities. And, so how has that sort of set the project of queerness on a backtrack?
Sorry, Pratham, there's some construction sound here. So I didn't hear the first part of your question. What were you saying about capitalism?
Yeah, see, there is like sort of this widespread belief that there is no such thing as ethical consumption under capitalism. While of course there is substance to it, but then the level of appropriation that queerness has had with neoliberalism, that's appalling. Like I remember going to Pride parades, and then people go to McDonald's after Pride parade, and I'm like, oh great, yeah. So about that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the more, arguably the most pressing current way in which queerness has been appropriated is, to use the popular word, the mode of pinkwashing that we're seeing in the Israel-Gaza conflict, in the Israel-Palestine conflict. And Israel is banking on the fact that, a city like Tel Aviv has the biggest pride parade march in Asia. And so they're very proud of the fact that they are welcoming of non-heterosexual orientations. But of course, the orientation that they are completely hell-bent on eradicating from the first face of the earth is Palestinian. So that gives you a sort of very, very clear example that even people willing and able to commit genocide are still wanting to claim a certain kind of queer superiority for themselves, or a certain kind of queer brownie points for themselves. And that, as you rightly say, is a deeply disturbing project. But that takes me back to what I said earlier, which is that desire is not always positive. It's not always liberatory. It's not always something that we can like. It's not always happiness producing. Desire can be deeply problematic, right? You can, for instance, if you think of someone who thinks of themselves as an absolute feminist politically, but their desire or their desire sexually is to be dominated. I mean, that is a deeply problematic desire for that person. If you believe that you have to be uniform and consistent and singular. Now, if we are thinking about desire as being almost an extension of being inconsistent and a lack of, and lacking in singularity, then we are sort of becoming more used to this landscape that we are being surrounded by. So if the Israeli government and the Israeli people are patting themselves on their back for their progressive queer politics, in the same breath as they refuse to acknowledge Palestinians as human beings, then that needs to give us pause, not to say, oh, the Israelis are being hypocritical, which no doubt they are, but to actually say, where is this language of liberation taking us if it can so easily be co-opted in the most genocidal of projects? And I think that's the question we need to ask. Not is such and such individual or such and such organization being hypocritical or not. The question becomes, why is our investment in liberation so deep? Why is our investment in a singularity of being so deep? Why is our investment in consistency so deep? Because if we're thinking about consistency, then my argument is that we cannot be thinking about desire. But if we're thinking about desire, we need to be able to take on board the fact that it's not always liberatory. Even if you just think about examples closer to home, some of the most vocal supporters of the BJP, if you think about Lakshmi Tripathi, for instance, many members of the Hijra community, many members of the queer community, are very, very vocal in their support of a phobic Hindutva project. So we need to pause and ask ourselves. So rather than pointing fingers at them and saying, you people shouldn't do this, we need to point fingers at ourselves and say, what is it that we are investing in? And I really think it's important that people are so loath to question themselves, are so invested in the idea of themselves being perfect and themselves being good hearted or whatever it is. And of course, I'm sure many of us are. But that doesn't mean we should be exempt from scrutiny, that our investments politically should be exempt from scrutiny. And I think this is a classic example of how we need to scrutinize our investments.
Yeah. Very interesting, a very insightful argument. Yeah, Gauri, you can go ahead.
So, ma'am, you spoke about pink washing in Israel right now, and I think what's happening in Palestine essentially shows how the process of homo nationalism works, like folding certain non-normative subjects into the fold of life, while other people are deprived of it, and the fact that queerness itself has now become embroiled in war making and nation building. So, according to you, what are the implications of such a project of pink washing on queer solidarities, and how can we articulate a more inclusive queerness?
Well, I think, Gauri, when I said we need to examine ourselves, I think one of the words we need to examine is the word inclusive. There's something actually quite coercive about that word, don't you think? Because it depends on an exclusion. Any project of inclusion depends on an exclusion. So my investment is never in inclusion. My investment is much more in another word that you used that unfortunately we're using too little of. My investment is much more in solidarities. So it's not a question, you don't have to be like me. You don't have to agree with me. You don't have to want to be me, but you can stand in solidarity with me on the basis of whatever it is that resonates with you. Solidarity, in my opinion, is the opposite of identity. The position we are in today politically in the world, whether it is the Israel Palestine question or whether it is the sexual politics question, all these belong or are part and parcel of the problem with what we might call identity politics. The minute you say, A, this is who I am, as though I have an identity that is fixed, and B, that I will form a community with everybody who is like me. The minute you do that, you're in the sphere of the very presence of Israel, which is an ethno nationalistic presence. The minute you say a country is for one kind of person or one kind of people, you are in the vicinity of identity. You're in the vicinity of identity politics. And no surprise that all these areas of the world, Israel, Palestine, India, Pakistan, Ireland, for instance, northern and southern, um, all these partitioned parts of the world were partitioned along lines of identity by the British. So again, we go back to the certain kind of colonizing mission for which no one seems to be holding the British accountable, other than perhaps Shashi Tharoor every now and then. But there is a way in which identity for me militates against solidarity. That's one of the greatest reasons why I am not at all invested in identity, except to really question it and oppose it. My investment is much more in solidarity. You don't need to be like me. I don't need to be like you, but I can stand up for you. I may not be a Dalit, but I can stand side by side for Dalit politics. I might not be Muslim, but I will very much stand side by side in protesting the CAA in Shaheen Bagh. That is what it means to exist in solidarity, to get over yourself, to get out of yourself, to get into spaces of otherness, to allow otherness to affect who you are. That's what it means not to live or abide by normativity. And if we really want to practice a queer politics, then that politics is not going to be one of exclusion. It's going to be a politics of solidarity. And that's the kind of politics I think we need to build.
Very well articulated how you spoke of solidarity and inclusivity essentially not being the same things, because we can stand up for people even if we don't identify with that. So I completely agree with that. Over to Pratham.
Yeah, like for instance, solidarity can be a perfect bedrock for building an intersectional framework that we should talk about. And I think we need to sort of revisit our ideas about inclusivity as well, because I think inclusivity is now word thrown like anything, like inclusivity, and without second thought to what are its larger implications as well. So yeah, my question is now on this topic about same-sex marriage, where your position is interesting because you're one of the few scholars on the progressive side who have given a critique of the Nafte judgment and the entire movement. And what are your thoughts on that? And I think one of your major arguments is how we are making granting of certain rights contingent on people's participation in certain institutions, and how that sort of militates against the idea for basic universalism. So yeah, would love to hear your thoughts on that.
And actually, this question follows really from what I was talking about last time, because the case, as it's called, for marriage equality, which is a phrase I find problematic, very much buys into the system. So what is amazing to me is that politics today seems to be less and less about questioning the system and more about finding ways of being a part of the system. And I find this astonishing, actually, right? The politics, the very definition of politics has to be about struggle, about actually disagreement, rather than saying, please, please, please include me, please. Because the minute, to go back to what I was saying to you, Gauri, the minute you include me, that means you're excluding somebody else. And so that idea of saying, please count me in, is a very dangerous premise on which to build a politics. So for me, my primary objection to same-sex marriage is that we are not going deep enough or far enough theoretically to question the injustice to which we might see ourselves as being subjected. So the injustice is that certain citizens of the country are being treated as second-class citizens by not being given the rights that a certain other segment is being given. No question about it. I think that's absolutely right. The question then becomes, how do we make sure that that kind of inequality and discrimination does not exist? Is it by saying we want to buy into the system that is discriminating against us? Or is it to say we need to come up with another way in which such discrimination does not take place? And one of the things that I have suggested is that we have to absolutely uncouple rights from marriage. That it doesn't matter, it shouldn't matter to the government whether I am married or not, whether you are married or not. It shouldn't matter whether I am gay or straight or bisexual or asexual or anything for me to be able to get a ration card. There is no sense, it doesn't make any sense in any world to say that my ability to buy things at a fair price depends on my sexual orientation and on my marital status. It makes no sense. It's like saying only heterosexual people should be allowed to vote. It's that blatant and bizarre. And so the minute you uncouple rights from marriage, suddenly you're going to see the sheen that attaches to marriage starts fading. That the sort of luster that we associate with marriage starts to sort of seem a little tawdry. And that is the level at which we need to fight. The fight cannot be at the level of please include me in your discriminatory institution. The fight has to be, how do we end discrimination based on this particular institution? So why on earth would I? And this is around the world. Historically, marriage has been shown to be an institution that is always, even in the best possible ways, patriarchal. That is always going to be giving women the short end of the stick. I mean, the number of ills associated with marriage are legion. Why on earth would I, as a queer theorist, would I, as a queer subject, want to clamor to participate in that institution? It makes zero sense to me, theoretically or politically. And so this is why I was not a supporter of the same-sex marriage case, even though I must add that the arguments that they put within that framework were very strong ones. And the Supreme Court could easily have acknowledged those arguments and extended the franchise of marriage. But it shows you, and when you read the judgments, you can see this very clearly, the way in which the Supreme Court judges were being utterly phobic. So I'm not a supporter of the case, but I think I found the judgments also utterly phobic and really utterly problematic. So I hope now we will find the courage to mount the attack in a different direction and from a different point of view.
Yeah, and it reminds me a lot of what other theorists have talked about, how marriage is also like sort of cultural citizenship, which in the neoliberal framework we opted to very readily, and then the
Yeah.
entire, even in the US, that has, how has that panned out? So yeah, Gauri, you could go ahead. And yeah,
So,
like
ma'am,
more power to abolishing marriage, all in favor of no marriage. That's like one of fun only.
So, ma'am, you spoke of same-sex marriages. Adding on to what Pratham asked. As an economics student, I find it interesting how we sometimes have the need to exclude the political and social aspects of our life to certain economic phenomena. Right. So, like politicians in the past few years have overwhelmingly spoken on brain drain, but they fail to address the underlying causes, like the fact that the youth is not leaving just for a better job or monetary prospects, but in many cases to lead a life of dignity. So, a social and political crackdown on marriage and love is forcing India's queer community abroad. So, why do economists and even lawmakers need to intuitively and interpretively look at this queer brain drain? And according to you, how can this be achieved?
So, Gauri, it's not just queer brain drain, right? It's brain drain, period. And brain drain, yes, it is also because a staggering percentage of college graduates are not getting jobs in India. Something like 42% of people with BAs are not getting jobs. It's huge. And it just shows you where the impetus of the government has been for the last 10 years, has not been in income generation or economy generation or job generation. It has been in cultural, social, ideological hatreds, and of course, then in plumping up Mr. Adani and Mr. Ambani's economic prospects, which are very good or have been at least. Right? Economics is a strange beast, Gauri, and as you know, as you should know, as a student of economics, on the one hand, it is the subject that has the potential to be a truly cutting edge liberal arts subject. Because as you yourself pointed out, economics stands at the cusp of so many different strands of our lives that come together, right? Culturally, socially, intellectually, politically, financially, all this is encompassed in economics. But economics increasingly, and certainly over the last, let's say, 50 years, has been so successful in removing itself from the realm of politics and culture, in making itself so mathematical, in sort of the fundamental basis of economics that presumes rationality, right? Presumes that every human being is rational, is clearly an assumption that does not work. And yet there has been an unwillingness to revisit that. So, economics, unfortunately, is moving from being one of the most capacious subjects with which to think about the world to being a more or less moribund and inflexible way of looking at the world. Right? And so, you're absolutely right that you cannot, in fact, separate these strands from one another. That it is very much about leading a life of dignity. Gauri, one of the things I will disagree with you, it's not queer people who've had to lead a life of non-dignity here. In fact, if anything, even someone like the RSS chief, Mohan Bhagwat, comes out and says, oh, homosexuality is not incompatible with our culture, by which he means whatever he means, I don't know. But if you're a lower caste person, your life of dignity is non-existent. If you're a woman, your life of dignity is pretty non-existent. In fact, even in a city like Delhi, as we all know, the number of women you see in public is so few, is so low. The number of women in the workforce in Delhi is so little, it's abysmal. So there are a lot of people in this country who have very, very, very little dignity attached with their being in the world, which is why you're seeing all this exodus, right? I myself went abroad to study to do my PhD in the 1990s. I'm trying to think of how old I actually am. And many, many, many of us came back in the 2000s because things were going so well here. But I timed my return so badly that it was just on the eve of the last 10 years. And so what people had been talking about, and you can again look it up in newspapers and things, of the reverse brain drain. So many of us came back because there were so many exciting opportunities here. Now people have just been fleeing en masse. And what's ironic is that even those people who support the Hindutva project are noticing, oh my God, there's nothing here for my children to do. So they're being sent abroad to study or to work or whatever it is, right? And they don't see the connection between what they're supporting politically and the quality of their life socially, economically, and culturally. It is that separation that we need to bridge. We need to weave the fabric of our lives together again, rather than allowing strands to be separated and thought about in phobic and hateful ways.
I mean, I noticed this apoliticism in my classroom. Like whenever we're talking about economics, it's just we're trying to separate the social and the political from it, which doesn't make sense. I mean, so many economic
No.
theories were evolved on the basis of politics. So yeah, I agree with that, and I agree with the fact that suddenly there's just so many people leaving for many different reasons. And you spoke about the results on Tuesday, and I mean, first of all, just so surprising and so beautifully surprising personally for me. So, in light of the 2024 Lok Sabha election result, do you think there's a possibility of greater discourse around progressive gender and sexuality laws in the parliament? Like, is having a greater representation of the opposition perhaps indicative of a more positive step in that direction, where we could have more conversations around the kind of bills that are being passed in the parliament?
Certainly, and those two are slightly different, right? Certainly, a greater plurality of voices is a welcome thing. The one thing that the Indic subcontinent has always had going for itself is that plurality. The last 10 years, the real danger was the consolidation of that plurality, the silencing of that plurality into a voice of singularity. And that was the most frightening aspect of what was happening, which let us hope is going to be at an end now. But they're two different things, right? So legal judgments and parliament bills are not the same thing. So, for instance, we've had very progressive legal judgments. Let's just take the NALSA judgment as one, the trans judgment for one, which is so progressive, unlike anywhere else in the world. It talks about gender as being what you think of yourself and not a biological phenomenon, right? Not a physical phenomenon, but what you think of yourself, self-determination. That judgment, which is really incredible in many ways, has now been translated by Parliament into the Trans Act, which actually dilutes many of the legal rights of self-determination. So again, when we're talking about separating out strands, we need to build closer bridges to legal judgments and parliamentary bills as well. And parliamentary bills, as you know, Gauri, have had zero debate in the last 10 years, zero argument, zero contestation. So let us hope that will change as well, such that the spirit of the better judgments that we have seen in the past is able to be translated into the bills and acts that actually pass in Parliament.
So, ma'am, you've also advocated for an interpretivist approach to law, which essentially calls on judges to employ their astute understanding when dealing with complex cases when it comes to the intersection of gender and sexuality. So, how can the interpretivist reading of law, when it comes to issues like marital rape, like, as socially, we still don't acknowledge that. So, how can we expect the lawmakers, how can we expect the legal body to uncover the gender dynamics within the political and social structures and give us insights into the tension between desire and violence?
Yeah, and there is a tension between desire and violence because desire can often be violent, and that is again one of its problematic or really undesirable characteristics. Marital rape is it's a blot on the way in which our legal system works. Many judges have actually spoken out against it in individual judgments, in talks that they have given, in essays that they have written. A few judges still hang on to it, this idea that a woman has to obey her husband. And as long as we have those judges, of course, we're still going to have judgments that are incredibly brutal in relation to women. This is something that has to change legally. And the reason it has, and it can only change if we take marriage down from its pedestal. And this goes back to what I was saying earlier. If everyone is clamoring to be included in the institution of marriage, then how are we actually cutting marriage down to size? The minute you say marriage is sacred, which, by the way, it is not in Islam, for instance, and in many, many Hindu traditions also it is not. It is a legal arrangement. So when you're saying marriage is sacred, you're actually speaking a very, very biblical language of the Christian colonizer, of the British colonizer, not Christian colonizer, because there are many Christians who also criticize this idea of marriage. So again, it's the language that we speak. If you are saying marriage is sacred, then anything that goes on within the marital institution has to be sacred and good. But if you are saying marital rape is a clear and present danger that many, many, many tens of thousands of women in our country are subjected to daily, then you're also saying that marriage cannot be seen as a sacred institution. It has to be seen as a social institution, which in a society that is deeply patriarchal and feudal in nature is going to carry the taint of feudalism and patriarchy. Given that, then, marital rape has to be acknowledged as a reality and has to be criminalized as such. So again, you see how all these questions are tied up with one another. And we can't just sort of think of one little corner of the pie and say, how can I get included in this? We have to think about how the sort of butterfly effect that has on multiple ways of thinking about the social, cultural, and political ideas of sexuality.
I completely agree with the fact that there are so many multitudes, like we can't point out certain things and act on them individually, and they are essentially just intertwined with each other. And I do think while there's a hope that we can have more social progression towards, an ideal society, but the fact that we have an independent legal system is a plus, but to sort of tackle that socially still remains a problem, I think. So, yeah, over to Pratham.
Yeah, this is probably going to be a last question.
I was just
Throughout
just going to say, because I'm getting quite
yeah,
exhausted.
yeah,
But
yeah,
yeah.
yeah. So throughout this session, you have warned against, how queerness or in fact any emancipatory system can be co-opted into this identitarian specificity, which tends to be more assimilationist rather than truly emancipatory. So one, how do you think we need to reorient our ways of thinking, advocacy, and activism in a manner that aligns with what you call as queer universalism in your book, Indifference to Difference? And how do you think desire can help in engendering this form of solidarity, which both at once decenters the self and equips the self with the revolutionary potential?
Yeah. Thank you, Pratham. That's a great last question as well to ask. When I am called on, as I am sometimes, to do workshops with, I teach at Ashoka University, the incoming batch of undergraduates in their orientation week, I'm often called upon to do a workshop with them or a session with them on gender and sexuality, right? And everyone expects that this session will be about my talking about, what it means to be trans, what it means to be gay, what it means to be lesbian. And I don't do any of that because that's not what I'm interested in. What I do in my entire session is ask people who they think they are. So if we are assuming that the audience for which this workshop has been commissioned is a largely heterosexual audience who need to be told about trans people, about gay people, this, that, and the other, who do they think they are if they think of themselves as heterosexual? And what's always astonishing in these workshops is that people can never quite define it, right? So when I say, okay, so you think you're a man, what does it mean to be a man? Is it X, Y, Z? And they'll say, no, I'm a man, but I'm not a man in that way. Okay, I'm a woman, but I'm not a woman in that way. So then what does that mean? If you're not a man in that way or not a woman in that way, how can you say you're heterosexual? for instance? Or how can you say you're homosexual? How can you say you are anything with any certainty? So my job, my self-appointed job, I don't think that's what people were thinking when they asked me to do the session. My self-appointed job is to make people less certain rather than more certain. My self appointed political role is to have everyone question themselves rather than saying, here is the strange species called homosexuals. And let us be kind to homosexuals because they do things in a different way. Instead of that, which is the template that's followed in such workshops around the world, instead of that, why don't we say, what is it about ourselves that makes us normative, that we believe is normative? Why don't we break down that idea of normativity to say that every single one of us is multiple, is problematic, is multitudinous, is tumultuous? And from that position of uncertainty, develop an appreciation for otherness. Not from an anthropological perspective to say, I am great and I will study you as the strange, primitive savage out there, but to say, what is the savagery in me that might allow me to be more skeptical of claims of civilization, claims of purity, and actually think more democratically across lines that divide us, across lines that might separate me from you.
Yeah, extremely insightful answer. All right, so it's correct that we need to sort of move ahead, move from like this temporality of certainty to a temporality of risk, like many scholars point out, and how more skepticism and just embracing our messiness and contradictoriness. So yeah, thank you for that.
Thank you so much,
Thank you
ma'am,
both very much.
for this insightful talk, and thank you so much for taking out the time to speak to us. I would like to thank you on behalf of Caucus and the Pro. And I personally learned so much, and I think a lot of my questions were answered, and I'm sure same goes for Pratham. And I really hope that our readers and our viewers will get something out of it too. So thank you so much for sitting here.
Thank you both very much. And I'm glad we were finally able to do this. Yeah. Good luck with everything.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you so much for that.
Okay. Bye.